My immigrant parents, refugees from Armenia and the Turkish massacres, moved to California from New York a few weeks after my birth in 1916. We lived on a farm near Kingsburg, a Swedish town. Even when I was in high school, Kingsburg's mayor, a Swede, spoke a heavily accented English. Besides these Swedes, there were Armenians, Danes, Portuguese, Japanese, Mexicans, and a few others. When I started kindergarten, my English, like that of the other children, was limited. In the first grade, I met my first real American, an elderly woman teacher named Mrs. Pinkley. I've forgotten the names of others of my early teachers, but I remember hers because we were all impressed by this real American. Years later, I realized that a few... Years later, I realized that a very few old-line Americans did live in the area, but none were near us. In the early 1920s, when my father became pastor of an Armenian church in Detroit, we left by train for that city. As a youngster, it was for me a great adventure as well as a major dislocation. On board the train, I was immediately interested in the man who seemed to me to be the most important man running the train and the strongest, the Pullman porter. He was also the first black man I had ever seen. I followed him around to his tolerant amusement, and I began to ask questions. As a boy in Kingsburg, I knew that As a boy in Kingsburg, I knew that there all of us identified people. As a boy in Kingsburg, I knew that there all of us identified people in terms of their country of origin. What country does your family come from? Accordingly, I asked him the same question, and what language did they speak? The answers were surprising. He came from Chicago and his family from Alabama. His grandparents? Alabama. His great-grandparents? His great-great-grandparents? He was amused. As far back as I know, Alabama, and all spoke English. I then knew that I had met my second. I then knew that I had met my first second. I then knew that I had met my second real American. All right, that's a whimsical tale. No. I'm finished. So cruel. Looking back years later, I realized how right I was. Apart from the Indians, most of us are immigrant stock of relatively recent origin. Two groups have a long history here, the English and the Negros, and both have English names and deep roots in the United States. These two groups best qualify as, quote, old-line Americans and, quote, real Americans, end quote, because their lives, culture and outlook are most formed by an American tradition. The United States is their country in a deeper sense. The presidential candidacy of Jesse Jackson was a noteworthy step in American history, but it was not without some unhappy aspects. In particular, Jackson played the role of the black outsider demanding entrance. Valid reasons for this stance are by no means lacking, but the more important and positive fact that needs emphasis and development is that of the insider. My perception as a child was right. Blacks are old-line Americans. As such, they have a major stake in American life in the protection and development of their country. In Europe, there are growing hostilities against the large members of Middle Eastern minorities who came there after World War II to fill the needs for workers. In Africa, there are racial and intertribal hostilities of major character. In Asia, we find that India, Pakistan, and other countries have ancient and explosive racial conflicts. The United States and the Americas are almost alone in working to regulate such tensions to past history. In that effort, blacks have a necessary role as old-line Americans working to strengthen and develop the American hope. That was an unusual ending. Okay. Crippled minds. Why can't you see? 2. Crippled minds. A friend today told me of a serious problem in her family business. They provide corrective shoes for crippled people. The shoes fit, and they do everything the doctors require of them, but the patients and customers are increasingly unhappy. The problem is a new and growing one. Many of these cripples somehow dream that a pair of corrective shoes will make their defect disappear. The shoe fits, is a major help, and is comfortable, but they burst into tears or go into a tantrum because they expect more from a pair of shoes than shoes can deliver. In this, these cripples are like all too many people of our day. They demand laws to give them a status which other people have won the hard way. The laws are passed and major social adjustments are made, but too often their basic problems remain. They have expected of law more than law can deliver, and their reaction is a revolutionary rage. Such people have crippled minds. Handicaps are real in this world, and they're not pleasant. It's even worse when men themselves make or create handicaps for others. But life always involves a struggle. The farmer can't order weather to suit his needs, nor prices to fatten his bank account. He must live with reality and work to master it. The crippled mind, however, holds a grudge against life and against other men. The crippled mind, however, holds a grudge against life and against other men for his handicaps. He demands that a magic wand.
A magic wand.
He demands that a magic wand be somehow waved and all handicaps abolished. The only result of such an attitude is that a greater handicap is created because the mind is progressively crippled by such a faith. We live in an age when men want salvation from a pair of shoes and a new world from a new statute in the law books. When this hopeless dream betrays them, the reaction is to smash the system. It is a revolutionary rage. Oh yes, rage. I got it right. The problems in our world are real enough, but most serious problems are in the hearts and minds of men. They won't disappear with a wave of the hand, nor with a new set of laws. Only as these people are regenerated by Jesus Christ can they be freed from their major and central problem, a crippled mind. If the Son therefore shall make you free, ye shall be free indeed. John 8:36. Their need is for, quote, the glorious liberty of the children of God. Romans 8:21. Salvation is both health and victory, and only Christ can give it. Three, a life of great gain. A few years ago, a very able woman who had been a very great A few years ago, a very able woman who had been in real estate had served as a bank trust officer and had held one or two other responsible positions called my attention to the irrationality of people's desires. In buying or building a house, people demanded that the same house satisfy very contradictory purposes. For example, a woman would require a kitchen to have a compact construction to save steps and yet be roomy enough to include a variety of things. What one kitchen gave her excluded one or another of her... Hello? Oh, that's a very good point. What one kitchen gave her excluded one or another of her requirements. What Mrs. W.K. told me has often been in my mind because she called attention to a common form of irrationality. In politics, economics, marriages, and in every other area, men and women demand that their daydreams, not realistic goals, be realized. One recent editorial called some members of Congress self-deluded because... hello. So Congress self-deluded because at one and the same time they sought the advantages of both free trade and mercantilism, a manifest contradiction. In marriage, men and women live in terms of impossible expectations and then wonder why their marriage does not work. Employees who will not do the work required of them complain that they are not appreciated. Employers expect respect from their employees when they themselves will give others no respect. To want contradictory things is to imagine that we are God, and that reordering the world to suit our imagination rather than God's law is possible for us. I just whacked the table. The nation, rather than God's law, is possible for us. We are, however, commanded in such things to, quote, be content with such things as ye have, Hebrews 13:5, or, quote, godliness with contentment is great gain, 1 Timothy 6:6. Our ideas about, quote, great gain, end quote, envision the possession of imagined things, not godliness with contentment. Our imagination is not governed by reality. In imagination, the world is reordered to man's wishes, and the impossible becomes routinely imagined as real. It becomes easier for people to live in their dream world than in the real world, and they choose that unreal world. But to be alive in God's world, however great its problems, is a privilege and an opportunity, whereas our dream world is closer to sleep and to death. To live with reality is thus great gain. David says, quote, I will both lay me down in peace and sleep, for thou, Lord, only makest me dwell in safety. Psalm 4:8. The imagined power and prosperity of daydreams mask impotence and retreat.
It's very fun.
Rottenness. 4. Rottenness. 4. Rottenness in the bones. The 10th commandment forbids covetousness, and envy is repeatedly condemned in Scripture. Unfortunately, what the Bible teaches and what today's politicians and preachers teach are two different things. Men today are being taught to covet and to envy. Are you a worker? Then be envious of what your shop owner or factory owner has and resent it with all your heart. Are you a farm labourer? Then believe that the farmer holds what he has by defrauding you and that he is an ugly brute who has made his money at your expense. Are you a member of a minority group? Then demand your quote-unquote rights and declare everything in America is evil because you're not in possession of it. Preachers and politicians seem to believe in a new beatitude of their own making. Blessed are the envious, for they shall inherit the earth. They are out to make it come true or else destroy the country if they cannot. But let's take our text from the Bible, not from these preachers and politicians. A sound heart is the life of the flesh, but envy the rottenness of the bones. Proverbs 14:30. A sound heart means a regenerated heart, a converted man who lives by the word of the Lord, not by envy. And envy is the rottenness, the decay of the bones. A man's bones are the structure of his body. He cannot stand without them. Some people with rare diseases of the bones are scarcely able to stand or move because their spinal column may crumble. The bones make possible man's ability to function. Now, a society with rottenness of the bones is a society. Now, a society with rottenness of the bones is a society ready to crumble, ready to collapse. It cannot stand. A society which is dedicated to envy as a way of life, a society whose political and religious leaders promote the evil of envy as the great virtue and cure-all, has about as much future as a man bent on drinking poison to cure his hiccups. These ungodly men are, quote, proud, knowing nothing, but doting about questions and strifes of words, whereof cometh envy, strife, railings, evil surmisings. 1 Timothy 6:4. They are only able to create a world in their own evil image, not the paradise they dream of. They can only communicate their own rottenness of bones, and, like walking epidemics, spread their contagion in church and state. But the godly, laying aside all envying, will look to Christ for new life, not to the evil ones, and they shall never be confounded. 1 Peter 2:1-6. I'm kind of happy with that. It's not there. It's not 100% there, but it's a man's world. 5. Is it a man's world? One of the things I dislike more than women's lib is the attitude that it's a man's world. When I hear a man say this, I regard him as both stupid and anti-Christian. Of course, there are many men who would like it to be or believe it really is a man's world, and some women have become brainwashed into believing it is true. Not so. It's God's world, and you'd better believe it. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. Psalm 24:1. It's suicidal for any man or woman to believe otherwise. It means living in terms of a lie. Some men will at once object that the Bible places men in a position of authority over their wives. They are unwilling to add that whatever authority God gives to anyone, to parents, husbands, wives, churches, states, or anyone else, has only one purpose, that God's will be done, not man's. Whatever authority God gives to anyone is always and at all times and there. Nopers. Anyone is always and at all times and places totally subject to and under his authority. No man has any authority in and of himself or for the purpose of pleasing himself. Even Jesus Christ, the incarnate Son of God, exercised no independent authority. The governing principle of his life was simply this: Lo, I come to do thy will, O God. Hebrews 10:7. His prayer in the Okay, that's why. I wonder why. Wonder I made such striking progress. His prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane was, Thy will be done, Matthew 26:42. Jesus Christ could not exercise any authority apart from God's will, and how dare any man do so? The next time anyone tells you it's a man's world, or any kind of world other than God's world, set him straight. Our world's problems are due to such thinking. People are trying to make this into a man's world, and they are destroying themselves and others in the process. Such thinking is basic to man's original sin. his desire to make God's creation over into man's world, in which man is his own God. The world is not your oyster nor mine. Even more, we are not our own, but are ourselves a property, whether regenerate or unregenerate, of the sovereign God. Stop damaging and misusing God's property. Put it to the use, service, and calling He intends for you.
Walk a talk.
6. Planting trees. 6. Planting trees. Recently, my wife Dorothy and I visited an old friend. I had not seen Mrs. N.A. for 18 or 19 years. Originally from a Fresno County farm, she now lives in a coastal area where she and her husband retired some years back. Yum, sim, yum. More an American usage as well. Coastal area where she and her husband retired some years back when her husband became ill. She is now 9 years a widow, 85 years old, and she walks with a crutch under one arm and a cane in her other hand. She lives alone. She has almost an acre of garden and fruit trees and enjoys her garden work. Best of all, she showed us happily 6 or more young fruit trees which she planted this spring. Does this sound strange to you? A crippled woman of 85 planting for the future? Well, this was once an accepted Christian practice, going back to Old Testament times. The world was not empty when we were born into it, and we are not supposed to leave it poorer because we have been here. Some talking in the background. Deuteronomy 20, 19 and 20 forbids the destruction of fruit trees even for military purposes. Quote, "For the tree of the field is man's life." End quote. Let's see if that bump came through. All right. Men rightly saw that, negatively, this law of God forbids the wanton destruction of fruit trees, but positively, they saw that the implication is that man should plant and protect the producing trees. Trees. El español. They saw that the implication is that man should plant and protect the producing trees. Earlier, many Israelites and later Christians planted fruit trees for a future they would not always see. Johnny Appleseed planted apple trees, fenced the seedlings, and made a wide circuit to care for them in the wilderness, so that, by the time settlers began to move in, there was fruit there for them. Mrs. N.A. thus belongs to a long and holy tradition. What she is doing sounds strange today, because, as a nation, we are destroying our inheritance rather than adding to it. We have created a parasitic civil government which penalises work and thrift and harms foresight. Therefore, we are undergoing judgment. Alrighty. Oops, wrong one. The right one. 7. Virtue. The word virtue comes from the Latin and meant originally strength, courage, and excellence. In the Old and New Testaments, the words in Hebrew and Greek translated as virtue mean in the original languages force, strength of mind or body, and power. This meaning of power as virtue is clear in Luke 6:19 and 8:46. In Proverbs 31:10 and 29, the virtuous woman is a strong woman, strong in character and in her abilities. In Proverbs 12:4 we read, quote, "A virtuous woman is a crown to her husband, but she that maketh ashamed is as rottenness in his bones." Because a virtuous woman is morally and in every other way strong and capable, she adds so greatly to her husband's calling that she enables him to be a ruler or king in his realm, whereas a morally weak and incompetent wife is a source of shame and weakness, as rottenness in his bones. A husband lacking virtue is fully as disastrous as his wife, if not more so. Virtue, thus, in its biblical meaning, is strength, moral strength, the wise use of abilities, and a general competence. A boy or girl reared without the discipline of work, self-government, and moral force thus lacks virtue in the biblical sense. Too many people act as though virtue means not doing certain sinful acts. Its biblical meaning involves something far more positive. Virtue is this strong and positive faithfulness to every word of God and a courageous stand for the Lord in every area of life and thought. Virtue in the Bible means power. Today, as always, true virtue is God's power at work in this world through men. God grant us a virtuous people. Okay, well, I think I'm going to let that do me for this recording. Know why that's off a little bit. That's all right. Cool. So great. So hope to see you in the next exciting installment. Yeah. Well, I don't know what I'm talking about. So we're going to sign off and say hope to see you later. For a word in season.